Good afternoon. It's Sunday, the 6th of September. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Governments in Western Europe were today clamoring for the creation of a common policy regarding the migrant crisis. And while criticism regarding a lack of direction from their leaders is growing, residents of several cities across the continent spent their Sunday morning welcoming the traumatized refugees. We get more in this report from Dennis Zinn.
Well-wishers in Munich and in other cities across Germany gathered at their local train stations this morning to welcome the refugees with cheering and applause. This train was carrying citizens of Syria and Iraq who arrived after weeks of difficult travel since fleeing the situation in their own country.
We're happy in Germany, but we're tired, very tired, because this very dangerous.
We need one solution, just one. I wish all countries work together to find one solution for us.
Similar demonstrations of support took place in Paris, and the crowds called on the French government to do more. But the flow of migrants into Western Europe is continuing unabated, and the atmosphere was not so accepting everywhere. Clashes erupted between police and migrants in several transit locations that are expected to hold back the surge of traffic to the west.
I think no respect here, no food, no toilet, no water, no hotels, many troubles.
British Finance Minister George Osborne said that Britain and the rest of Europe are obligated to offer aid, but only to those people genuinely fleeing persecution.
It's absolutely clear we need a comprehensive plan across Europe and across nations who are concerned about this migration crisis. Yes, we must offer asylum to those who are genuinely fleeing persecution. Countries like Britain always have. We were one of the founders of the asylum system, and we will take, as the Prime Minister says, thousands more. But at the same time, you've got to make sure you've got aid going into the refugee camps.
Other European leaders echoed this call, saying that a unified policy must be adopted.
Certainly, from my perspective, reinforces the mission that we have to try to help and be as practical as we can on the ground, in programs and in the policy advice that we give. But it's everybody's business. It's not just international institutions' business.
It's an urgency we're facing, but it is not something that starts that day and finishes that day. It is here to stay, and the sooner we accept it psychologically and politically, the sooner we will be able to respond in an effective way.
However, there's still no firm demand in Europe to unite to stop the carnage in Syria itself and in other war-torn countries of the Middle East. Those leaders who are not interested in boots on the ground in Syria and Iraq now have to deal with boots on their own ground. Dennis Zinn, IBA News.
Israel today announced the beginning of construction on a new border fence on the Israeli-Jordanian border, meant to keep out migrants arriving from the east. The first section of the 30-kilometer-long fence will begin in the northern edge of Eilat and run through the Arava. The fence is designed to prevent entrance of infiltrators, similar to what happened when the fence was built on Israel's border with Egypt, which has dramatically reduced the entrance of migrants. In addition, the smuggling of goods has been almost completely eradicated. The full length of the fence will eventually be 230 kilometers at an estimated cost of 3 billion shekels. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded today to the Syrian migrant crisis, saying that while Israel is not apathetic to the human tragedy, it cannot flood Israel with migrants. Here with more is IBA's Eli Waldlanter.
Prime Minister Netanyahu rejected the possibility of taking in refugees from war-torn Syria, saying that while Israel was not unsympathetic to the suffering of citizens across its border, it simply did not have the capacity to absorb masses of people. Speaking at the start of the weekly cabinet meeting, Netanyahu said Israel is a very small country that lacks demographic and geographic depth. Therefore, we must control our borders against both illegal migrants and terrorism. The Prime Minister noted that Israel has already cared for approximately 1,000 wounded people from the fighting in Syria, and we have helped them to rehabilitate their lives. Regarding Israel's current migrant situation, Netanyahu told the ministers that Israel has been speaking with African heads of state, with the Italian Prime Minister, and with other European leaders about multilateral aid packages for the countries of origin in Africa in order to deal with the problem at its source. Netanyahu also related to the new border security barrier begun today on the country's eastern border with Jordan, saying the goal is to place on Israel's borders fences and obstacles that will make it possible to control its borders. To the extent that it is possible, we will encompass Israel's borders with a security fence and barriers that will allow us to control our borders, Netanyahu stressed. We will not allow Israel to be flooded with illegal migrants, those seeking work, and terrorists. Netanyahu's comments came a day after opposition leader Isaac Herzog called on the government to absorb refugees from Syria. Herzog's words sparked a backlash from fellow lawmakers. Immigrant Absorption Minister Zev Elkin of Likud said Herzog was trying to implement the Palestinian right of return via the back door. It is irresponsible and it must not happen. But Yesh Atid Chairman Yair Lapid supported the Prime Minister's position against Israel providing a safe haven for Syrian refugees, saying, "I wish Israel could allow itself to absorb refugees, but we can't even deal with the refugees already here." And finally, the cabinet approved the appointment of former Yesha chairman Danny Dayan as ambassador to Brazil and the Prime Minister's spokesman Mark Regev as ambassador to London. Laura?
Thank you, Ali. Christian educational facilities nationwide are still closed today as parents and leaders of the community continue their demands for additional funding. Some 2,000 parents and students came to Jerusalem to demonstrate outside of the Prime Minister's office. 33,000 students have been kept home from 47 different schools since the start of the school last year. The administrator's chief claim is that the Ministry of Education has been cutting budget allocations to the schools for years, even though they are unofficially recognized by the state. They say the government allocations now cover just 29% of their operating costs, but continue to limit how much parents can be charged for tuition and other fees. Convicted traitor Mordechai Vanunu gave his first television interview to the Hebrew language press to Channel 2 this weekend, nearly 30 years after his arrest for revealing sensitive information about Israel's alleged nuclear program, for which he served 18 years in prison. Joining us now to discuss the interview is Professor Yoel Cohen, a foremost expert on the Vanunu case and author of the book Whistleblower of Dimona and the Bomb. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. In your view, what were some of the most interesting revelations in the television interview?
Surprisingly, it wasn't too revealing. It did tell us about the Vanunu's feelings when he was abducted himself, but it didn't tell us too much about the program, the nuclear program itself. One interesting revelation was that even though the military censor approved the interview, for the very first time the military censor allowed the Italian angle, namely that Italy was the place from which Vanunu was abducted. That was the place, in other words, where Italian sovereignty was broken by the Israeli authorities. Up till now, the military censor has been very sensitive about that.
Professor Cohen, Vanunu claims that his revelations were not motivated by cash payment or revenge for being fired. He claims his motivation was to inform the country, the Middle East, the rest of the world, and the state of Israel about Israel's alleged nuclear arsenal. Do you buy it?
Well, in my book, I do need to come to the conclusion that Vanunu, who, by the way, studied philosophy, has a degree in philosophy from Ben Gurion University while he was working in Dimona as a night technician. And he came to the intellectual conclusion there was a dissonance or an intellectual conflict, a philosophical conflict between his work in Dimona and what he saw as how wars and conflicts should be carried out. And largely, I believe it was indeed ideology. At the same time, there was an understanding between the Sunday Times and Vanunu that given that Vanunu cannot go back, that he would benefit from a considerable amount of money for a book to be written, but he didn't actually get money for the information itself which he provided the Sunday Times.
And revenge for being fired, do you see any of that involved?
I think he had largely come to the conclusion this wasn't his place, because he came to the conclusion that that it wasn't quite the thing, again, for somebody who had become largely a pacifist. It is quite acceptable in the wider world to be anti-nuclear, and he identified with that, and I don't believe that that was his major consideration. His major consideration, indeed, from the literature, he wrote the famous poem, I Am Your Spy, I'm your spy. I'm one of those few people who had access to Dimona. I'm going to tell you what you don't know, what he thought the Israelis don't know, but which public opinion polls at the time indicated that even most Israelis knew and indeed supported that the country should possess a nuclear capability.
Vanunu has paid his price in prison. He has no new unrevealed secrets, so arguably he poses no security danger to Israel. Why not let him leave the country to join his wife in Norway?
Well, his wife in Norway is often here. She's a Professor Joachimson is indeed a professor from the in the theology, and she spent a large amount of time here since she began meeting Mordechai Vanunu, and they became, if you want, man and wife and common wife already for 8 or 9 years. As far as the Israelis are concerned, they are concerned that even though Vanunu may have disclosed the technical information, what would happen if he turned up in the United States, for example, and gave testimony before one of the Senate Foreign Aid Committees? And you know, there is a law in the United States which prohibits any US government from providing foreign aid assistance to a foreign country which has a nuclear facility not under international inspection, which is the case with Dimona. It would create, if we want, a diplomatic problem for the Israelis. So it may well be that rather than Mr. Mordechai Vanunu going to Norway with his wife and enjoy the sight of the fjords, an alternative solution might be that his wife, Professor Vanunu, Professor Joachimson, finding an Israeli university or a university in the Palestinian territories which is interested in her field of work, which is Old Testament studies. She's a specialist on Isaiah. She wrote a doctorate on it, and I'm sure she could find even more people in the Holy Land interested in her academic world, and that would be one way of resolving it. I don't believe that even though Vanunu wants to express his views rather than disclose any more information, I'd be very, very surprised if the Israeli government released him for a very, very long time. And it seems that Israeli courts are backing that thinking so far, at least.
Professor Yoel Cohen, thanks so much for coming in and sharing your insight. Following U.S. President Barack Obama's apparent securing of enough votes in the Senate to sustain his expected veto of disapproval over the Iran nuclear deal, Israel Television's Yaakov Achimeir spoke with visiting Republican Senator Tom Cotton about what opponents of the agreement can do now.
Well, in a way, it's very sad and disappointing that the president is portraying as a victory the fact that he might hold together a very small partisan minority of just 1/3 plus 1 of either the Senate or the House in our Congress, when in fact a large bipartisan majority of the United States Congress, as well as a large majority of the American people, are opposed to this deal. So even if this deal moves forward, I believe it'll be unprecedented in the history of U.S. foreign policy because it doesn't have broad bipartisan support, but rather a very small minority protecting the president's deal and upholding his veto. And I think raise uncertainty about the longevity of it. In fact, most Republican candidates for president in the United States have declared that they would stop this deal once they take office in 2017. So I believe that most people, in thinking about dealing with Iran over the next year and 3 months or so, will have real questions about whether that's a wise choice. And I think that's a good thing, because I don't think international corporations should be rushing into Iran to do business, because they're still a mortal enemy of the United States and of the West. So it's incumbent upon the United States to stand up to Iran's regional aggression. It's also incumbent upon the United States to strengthen our alliance with allies like Israel to help them stand up to Iran's regional aggression, because this vote in the Senate, whatever happens, won't end the story with Iran. It will simply end another chapter in our long history of confronting the Islamic Revolution.
What is the next chapter?
Well, Iran is still engaged in hot wars in places like Iraq and in Yemen and in Syria. The United States needs to push back against Iranian aggression. I think we should also consider a more comprehensive, immediate package of support for Israel, whether that's increased defense sales, increased intelligence cooperation and coordination, or strengthening diplomatic ties and showing through other kinds of signals that we're not going to stand for Iranian aggression, for instance, by adding not just one carrier back to the Persian Gulf, but adding a second aircraft carrier there.
Would you support a formal defense alliance with Israel?
Yes, of course. I mean, we've had a long-standing alliance with Israel, and that's based fundamentally on the American people and their support for Israel. So that goes.
No, I mean a formal alliance.
I always support stronger ties between the United States and Israel. I think it not just advances Israel's security, but advances the United States' security in the Middle East, because Israel is the lone constitutional democracy that supports that defends individual freedom and has free market economy. They represent our values and they serve our interest in the region.
I did not understand, excuse me, Senator. What are your plans the day after the vote?
Well, I don't want to get into details about what's going to happen the day after the vote, nor do I want to concede that we might lose the vote, since a majority of Americans and a majority of the Congress is opposed to the deal. But in the long term, I do think that we need to look, for instance, at improving and strengthening cooperation and coordination between our country's intelligence services. We also are going to have to return to the Iran Sanctions Act, a prior law that expires at the end of 2016 that relates not just to Iran's nuclear program, but also to their support for terrorism and their atrocious human rights record and other of their nefarious behaviors. So while I don't want to get into details at the time while we're still debating the vote on this nuclear package, there are many things that Congress can do both to confront Iran and to support our allies like Israel.
And to stop the agreement? To stop the implementation of the agreement?
If Iran violates their obligations under the agreement, then I, and I believe most members of Congress, will certainly push for aggressive enforcement of the terms of the deal. But the most likely party to breach this agreement is Iran.
Do you believe, Senator Cotton, that maybe a military operation is still on the table from the point of view of America?
Well, the credible threat of military force always has to be on the table to support our diplomatic efforts. It certainly has to be on the table when dealing with a rogue regime like Iran. The deal itself contained only one enforcement mechanism, the so-called snapback of sanctions. I don't believe that enforcement mechanism will be sufficiently effective to stop Iran if they are in fact cheating, and therefore the ultimate way to ensure that Iran doesn't obtain nuclear weapons, which after all is the goal of this deal, is the credible threat of military force.
The 18th Annual Jerusalem International Chamber Music Festival is underway and continues until September 12th. The prestigious event, which is held at the YMCA in the capital, hosts more than 60 performers, including a wide array of top-quality Israeli musicians, as well as renowned guests from Europe and America. The program attracts a wide audience of music lovers from around the country. The festival also includes master classes. Tickets run between 80 and 160 shekels. Taking a look at local finance, and with no currency trading on Sundays, the shekel remains the same, while share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange started off the trading week in the minus column. Here's a look at the mid-afternoon numbers. And before we turn to local weather, take a look at this. In Italy, baseball-sized hail came smashing down near Naples over the weekend in a storm that not only injured people and animals, but also caused damage to vehicles, crops, and more. These sized hailstones are the results of thunderstorms of speeds of at least 120 kilometers per hour, so you can imagine the wreckage they can cause. The thought almost makes the heat here at home a bit more bearable. And another heat wave ahead of us for the next several days. Here's the forecast at home and abroad for the next 24 hours. And that's all for this newscast. Aaron Viner will be here tomorrow with more news from Israel and abroad. Until then, I'm Laura Cornfield wishing you a great evening and shalom from Jerusalem.